Hi, I'm Dr. Sophie Duncan and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Magdalen College at the University of Oxford, and this is a series on Twelfth Night. So in the first module I'm going to talk about comedy. So the First Folio was the first collected edition of Shakespeare's plays, published in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death. It was prepared by John Hemming and Richard Condell, who were two actors in Shakespeare's company. And without it, we wouldn't be able to read about half of Shakespeare's plays, because it's the only source we have for them. And that includes very famous plays like Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, but it also includes Twelfth Night. So without the folio, the Twelfth Night would just be another lost play. Now the folio divides the plays into three categories: tragedy, history and comedy. And in this module I want to look a bit more closely at the idea that Twelfth Night is uncomplicatedly a comedy. And I'd argue that the divisions of the folio need to be seen as fluid, they're unstable. So Cymbeline, one of Shakespeare's late plays, is classed as a tragedy in the first folio, but is now normally termed a romance or a tragicomedy. Equally, Troilus and Cressida, when it first comes out in quarto, which is a short run of about 250 copies, like a single volume paperback, really, that's called a history when it first comes out. Then by the time of the folio it's called a tragedy, but now we normally call it a problem play. And it's usually grouped with All's Well That Ends Well and Measure for Measure in that sense. And problem play itself is a term invented in 1896 by the critic Frederick Boas. So there's a long history of moving genre boundaries about, and you need to question any generic definition. But still, on the face of it, Twelfth Night could be the quintessential Shakespearean comedy. So you've got mistaken identity, twins, strong heroines, a shipwreck, lots of marriages. It's sometimes seen as a transitional comedy, so the last of the happy comedies. So the comedies before are things like The Comedy of Errors, Midsummer Night's Dream. They're more straightforward. Twelfth Night has a comic fool character, Feste. The largest role in the whole play doesn't go to Duke Orsino, so you know, the romantic lead. By far, it's Sir Toby Belch. And the second largest male role is that of Feste. There's an explicit commitment in the play to mischief and merrymaking. So in Act 1, Scene 3, Sir Andrew Aguecheek asks Sir Toby, "Shall we set about some revels?" And Sir Toby replies, "What shall we do else?" Feste is constantly pointing out the ubiquity of foolishness. So in Act 1, Scene 5, he tells Olivia she's a fool to mourn for her brother's death. And he points out to Malvolio that while Sir Toby will be sworn that I am no fox, he will not pass his word for twopence that you are no fool. In Act 3, Scene 1, he claims that foolery doth walk about the orb like the sun, it shines everywhere. Of the 7 songs in the play, the majority are either comic or they're made to be so by being performed by drunks. And even the title, Twelfth Night, suggests the misrule and festivity at Christmas. And Twelfth Night was a holiday where, so the social orders reversed, servants could play pranks and somebody would be elected a kind of king or queen for the day. But Twelfth Night's also sometimes called the farewell to comedy, or the first of the dark comedies, and there is overlap with the tragedies. So it's a kind of obvious requisite of true comedy that nobody dies, but in Twelfth Night, 3 of the main characters are grieving for their closest family at the start of the play. So Olivia's recently lost her father and brother. Sebastian and Viola each believe that their twin is dead, and they also discuss their father's death. At the start of the play, after the shipwreck, the captain talks to Viola about those poor numbers saved with you from the wreck of the boat, which makes it clear there's a large number of people have died. Malvolio, meanwhile, is imprisoned and virtually tortured, and Feste overlaps most explicitly with the tragedies. So his song at the end of the play, "When That I Was and a Little Tiny Boy," appears in an altered but really quite similar form in King Lear, also sung by a fool, but during the tragic Heath scene. And even the title Twelfth Night is actually worth a second look. Although it is a period of misrule, it's the very end of misrule. It's the end of Christmas before boring grey January. And although we can't be sure of the exact chronology of Shakespeare's plays, and if you look in any edition of any of the plays, it'll give you a different list, it's worth noting that we do know that Twelfth Night comes very near the start of a period in which several of Shakespeare's major tragedies were written and first performed, including Othello, King Lear, Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra. So Shakespeare's increasingly moving in a tragic direction as he writes Twelfth Night and after that. And it's interesting that the folio classified comedies that come after Twelfth Night are all noticeably darker. They're the problem plays, so things like Measure for Measure and All's Well That Ends Well. At the same time, though, there are a lot of laughs in Twelfth Night. And Donald Sinden, who was a famous 20th century classical actor, I think he only died in 2014, he wrote an essay on playing Malvolio in Players of Shakespeare, where he actually describes how he annotated his script with the laugh he was aiming for in each line, and he'd mark the laugh out of 10. But obviously not every Malvolio would play in such an uncomplicatedly comic way. But early audiences would probably have read the Malvolio plot as a comic satire. So John Manningham was a law student at London's Middle Temple when Twelfth Night was performed there in 1602. And he wrote about seeing the play, and he homes in on the Malvolio part of the plot, noting that there was a good practice in it to make the steward believe his lady widow was in love with him, by counterfeiting a letter as from his lady in general terms, telling him what she liked best in him, and prescribing his gesture in smiling, his apparel, etc., and when he came to practice, making him believe they took him to be mad. And Malvolio is crucial to the play's early popularity. So as early as 1623, the King's Men were performing the play under the title Malvolio. The other plays performed at Middle Temple at the same time as Twelfth Night, they tend to be very bitter satires. So it's probably not surprising that Manningham focused on the darkest, most mocking aspect of the comedy. And actually, Twelfth Night's unusual for a comedy written about 1600 because there's a lot of romance at a time when most of Shakespeare's contemporaries are writing definite satires. So historically, there's been a critical misconception that comedy should get less attention than tragedy, that it's less weighty and serious, and that it belongs at the bottom of the genre hierarchy with tragedy at the top. So you should bear this in mind, but I'd like to leave you with another critical issue that's worth keeping in mind as you assess the genre status of the play. So not just whether or not it's a comedy, but what it means to be a Shakespearean comedy. So 20th century criticism has disagreed over whether Shakespeare's comedies are primarily conservative, so gender differences ironed out, subversive elements suppressed, and rebellious women quiet by the end of Act 5, or whether they're radical, so they permanently change society's norms and they leave questions hanging, nothing's resolved. And I'll give you a little look at two critics who kind of exemplify the different views. So first, the C.L. Barber. He was a mid-20th century critic, and he argued in his book Shakespeare's Festive Comedy, which I think is 1959 or thereabouts, he argues that Shakespeare's comedies reconcile, restore and maintain the social order after all the festivity, even if there might be some slight irony or ambiguity in the comic ending. Meanwhile, Mikhail Bakhtin, who's a Russian critic, who you'd associate most with the Russian formalist school, he saw the carnivalesque misrule of characters like Sir Toby as being bigger than the social order, and that the comic confusion the characters go through permanently changes and liberates them. So, in the first module, we've talked about the ways in which we receive Twelfth Night, and the ways in which we might look more closely at comedy as a genre. Of course, a huge part of how anyone receives Twelfth Night comes from the choices a theatre company and actors make in performance. So in the next module, I'll talk more about performance and how people might have received Twelfth Night in Shakespeare's time.